Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another event organized by the Observatorio de la Lengua Española y las Culturas Hispánicas en los Estados Unidos, a research center which, as many of you will know, is a joint project between the Instituto Cervantes and Harvard University, where we are actually located here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Today's event focuses on a very special accessibility tool, audio description, closely linked to audiovisual translation, and which has recently become more and more popular, better known to the general public, thanks to its presence in video on demand platforms. And to give us an updated overview of this accessibility tool, of audio description, focusing on the main differences regarding audio description practices between the US and Spain, we have a dear colleague from Barcelona, an expert who has been researching and teaching audio description for many years now, who kindly accepted my invitation to give us a talk on this topic at the Observatorio, and whom I am delighted to welcome and to introduce to you all today. Dr. Eva Espasa. Eva Espasa is a senior lecturer at the Department of Translation, Interpreting and Applied Languages at the University of Vic, Universitat Central de Catalunya in Barcelona, where she teaches or has taught audiovisual translation and accessibility, translation for advertising, and the translation of scientific texts, all of them at either undergraduate and or postgraduate levels. She holds a PhD in English Studies from the University of Barcelona, which she obtained with a dissertation on the translation of Shakespeare's comedies into Catalan, later published in book form as La traducció de l'escenari in 2001. Dr. Espasa has followed courses and seminars on translation theory and different aspects of translation in several prestigious universities in both the UK and Belgium. Her main research interests are audio-visual translation, focusing mostly on dubbing and documentaries, also translation and accessibility, theatre translation, and gender studies, topics on which she has lectured and published extensively. I'll just mention two of her articles, which are frequently cited by colleagues in the respective fields. One of them is particularly dear to me because of the field. It's titled Performability in Translation, Speakability, Playability, or Just Saleability. And another commonly cited article by Dr. Espasa is Myths about Documentary Translation. Her contributions on accessibility, which is a field where today's talk will be inscribed, include publications and participation at international conferences on audio description and the coordination of research seminars on accessibility at her own university. She is also the coordinator of the interdisciplinary research group TRACTE, which studies audiovisual translation, communication, and place, and was the principal investigator together with her colleague, Montse Corrius, whom I can see here. Hello, Montse, welcome to the Observatorio as well. So they were both the main investigators of the project TRAFilm on the translation of multilingual films in Spain, which resulted in a volume titled Translation Audiovisuals in a Kaleidoscope of Languages, published 2 years ago in 2019. Dr. Espasa is currently researching the translation and audio description of multilingual TV series on digital platforms in another funded project, Mufitabi, and this is the object of her topic today. So welcome, Eva. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and you have the floor now.
Thank you very much, Marta, for your kind presentation and especially for your invitation. It's a pleasure to be here across the Atlantic, but so close And we have been close for so many years now that is just great. So thank you very much. So I'll try to share my presentation. Okay, so I'll start. If anything happens, if you know, don't follow me or whatever, just scream and I'll stop. Okay, so this is the topic for this presentation. It's called Translating for the Blind on Video on Demand platforms. We wanted to include the blind in the title for the visibility for the blind, and also to incorporate audio description into translation studies. So, I mean, the title is very big, but we'll just see an overview of the topic, right? And the summary, I mean, the overview will be first on the introduction of accessibility on video on demand platforms, but very quickly. Also an overview of audio description guidelines. Then what challenges will focus on, basically multilingualism and also gender and a bit of cultural diversity. And this will be seen through the examples of these recent series, such as Orange is the New Black, the mini-series Unorthodox, which was offered just a year ago. Then also La Casa de Papel, that is Money Heist, and the Catalan series Merlí, and briefly some conclusions and avenues for research. So, audio description. A brief definition by pioneer audio describer and promoter Joel Snyder. This is a verbal version of the visual for the benefit of people who are blind or have low vision. We also have to mention that it's not just for those people who are blind or have low vision, which is the main audience, but increasingly audio description finds other benefits or other users, such as people with learning disabilities or people who have sort of functional blindness. That is, you are doing something else and you cannot look at the screen. So audio description, in fact, has many uses. We will not go back to all the history of audio description. We'll briefly focus on accessibility on video on demand platforms, which was initially slow. And as Ellis and Ken have claimed, the transition towards digital modes of delivery further disabled people with impairments. Initially, it was difficult also to access due to technology or because just audio description and accessibility was not incorporated in the design. So there's the view from a design for all that little by little accessibility is entering. And just brief mentions on how accessibility entered in the USA, mainly through lobbying from associations. For example, in 2011, the National Association of the Deaf filed suit against Netflix due to lack of captions for the deaf and hard of hearing, and then Netflix reacted. Then also, as regards audio description, there was pressure from the Accessible Netflix project. And then finally, audio description entered Netflix. And it started precisely with Daredevil, whose protagonist is blind, and also with other series such as Orange is the New Black. Then audio description in Spanish starts in the USA with Narcos that year, but a bit later. And then as of 2016, there's a settlement between Netflix and the American Council of the Blind to provide audio description within 30 days of the premiere and to add accessibility prompts, that is, to add screen reader support and to the ability to browse content by availability of descriptions, which is not always easy. You may find all the details which are updated in the American Council of the Blind's audio description project. There you can also find platforms which offer audio description and platforms which do not offer audio description. As regards Spain, Netflix arrived in 2015, and there is still very little audio description in Spain or in Spanish. it is slowly increasing, but still very inferior to audio description in English. As regards legislation, I mean, as regards commercial platforms, there is no compulsory, it is not compulsory to offer audio description yet, but European, the European Act on Accessibility will have to be adapted and then incorporated. But so far, it is mostly a question of will, as Garcia Prieto has denounced. And we have also to mention that it's very difficult to have reliable data on accessibility, as Blanca Arias Badia has shown. And there in the following slide, you can see an infography that Blanca Arias Badia prepared for her presentation on accessibility services in Spanish, which was presented in November 2020 at the virtual event Espasa en Casa, which can be followed in YouTube. And there, very graphically, you can see that, I mean, audio description in Spanish is less than 3% in those platforms. If you see, it's in orange in that infography. And it's also, I mean, you also find some captions for the deaf and hard of hearing in green, and interpretation in sign language is also very reduced. But concentrating on the description, you can see that there is very little audio description. However, we have to see that first, the situation is changing very much, very quickly. Second, that it's very difficult to obtain data, as Arias Badia herself has researched, and that, again, it's difficult, it's changing. So we'll have to conduct research to have access to all this data. Here, I just included a very specific, the views of a journalist, Núria del Saz, on her experience playing with accessibility devices. I know it's just an example. And in the past, we had done some research interviewing blind women and their access to culture, but this was just before access to digital platform. So we'll have to update this and generate that. So I just wanted to share with you this testimony, which I have roughly translated into Spanish in the second part. But if you want to access to the irony with which Núria del Saz shares her testimony, I would recommend to read it in her Spanish version. So Núria del Saz says that AD allows you to understand films and series, especially endings where there's no dialogue. However, AD in Spanish is not a priority for Netflix. Most English content on Netflix has English AD. And she says, when I do not understand some visual context, I pause my reproduction in Spanish, select English AD, rewind a little, listen to its English AD, and go back to the Spanish version. And she addresses young audiences. Young people, do you see how useful English is? She is, of course, referring to the topic where many Spaniards have problems with English, right? And then she recounts an experience in last Christmas. I made the most of Netflix resources last Christmas on a day of maximum boredom. I felt curious about the film. The synopsis was so bad that I could not help not watching the movie. A family trapped at a farm, surrounded by aliens, had to communicate through sign language to avoid being discovered by those beings. Not a single dialogue. We people with disabilities love challenges, so I plunged into the film. I activated the subtitles, but I got lost because I did not know what the characters were doing. I found out there was English audio description, and that was great. The English voice described the scenes. The voice on my iPhone read the subtitles aloud, and I had to show the screen to my husband and ask what the aliens looked like because nobody was telling me about that. So this is just an example of some ad hoc solutions that users sometimes find. Let's go to the audio description guidelines, a very quick overview from diversity to standardization or globalization. So in the 1980s, they're the beginning of AD practices as such as we know them. They start in the USA and Europe. Of course, audio description itself is as old as people whispering to one another when this is needed, as audio describer and researcher Bernd Benecke from Germany remind us. But the actual practices themselves start from the 80s. Then it's the first 10 years of the new millennium when guidelines in several countries are created to standardize the creation of audio description. And here in the slide, you have some years. In the UK, 2001, the ITC guidelines, which are still very influential. In Germany, 2004, France and Greece, 2008, and to focus specifically on the USA and Spain. In the USA, we have the Audio Description International Guidelines 2005, which then were revised and in 2009 and ratified by the American Council of the Blind. And Spain, the standard for audio description dates from 2005 and has not been revised. It's after 2010, 11, where there's more trends towards standardization or globalization, even though there were previous comparative studies before, like 2009 studies on Catalan audio description and comparing directives by Santa Maria and Bassols or by Vercouter in Belgium, 2009 too, and 2010 by the Royal National Institute of the Blind, written by Sonali Rai, who compares 6 guidelines from Spain, Germany, France, the USA, Greece, and UK. It is worth mentioning the ATLAB project, 2011-2014, which searched for common practices across Europe, not just comparing, but trying to find and really define good practices which are currently available, and also were followed by a project for training audio describers. And then we have the advent of platforms, where there are particular guidelines, which of course draw from all these prior work. And now we'll look at Netflix guidelines, but before, I wanted to mention that from the study by Sonali Rai for the Royal Council for the Blind in the UK, they found out that there were many similarities in guidelines. The main differences were first, in the topic of objectivity. They make it more specific. They refer to the descriptive language, whereas, for example, Germany and the USA prefer impartial phrasing. In other guidelines, such as in the UK, there is more freedom in using evaluative adjectives. And they give the example of using adjectives like pretty or handsome if the material requires it. But the thing about objectivity is a debate, a discussion that still goes on sometimes, even though after those European projects, at least in Europe, there's more agreement that objectivity is impossible, even though this doesn't mean giving opinionated descriptions, right? As regards naming of characters, there were also these differences that Germany and the USA prefer to mention the names only when they are mentioned in the audiovisual products, whereas the UK 2001 guidelines prefer to present them initially to avoid confusion. As regards the mention of colors, the ITC guidelines are more free, whereas in the USA and the France, they prefer that colors were associated with adjectives or other description that were significant for people who are congenitally blind. However, as we'll see, nowadays there's more agreement on the cultural importance of color, and they are more and more described generally. So now, yes, let's move and look briefly at the audio description style guide by Netflix. Why Netflix? Well, first, because there are these guidelines in other platforms. You don't have access to guidelines if they use them, and also because of the importance of Netflix itself. It has been researched, for example, by Pedersen in connection with subtitling and seen the role it is having into kind of standardization or globalization. In the case of audio description, it's not exactly the same because there's all this prior work we have mentioned, but the fact that we have Netflix all around the globe, that these guidelines are available that audio descriptions practices are more and more available does have a kind of globalizing effect. So briefly, the goal of audio description would be concisely conveying plot critical and not or character integral information that would otherwise be missed by blind or low vision viewers. The emphasis is on relevance and concision because in most audio description practices, the audio description unit is inserted between the gaps left among dialogues. Even though technological solutions could be implemented of having the screen stop, whatever, or introducing description through objects, not soundtracks, or including audio introductions which can be available in the internet or whatever, most standard audio description, especially in films, is restricted by the availability of spaces among dialogues. So relevance and concision are important, and in the guidelines from Netflix are structured around the typical questions of journalism: who, what, when, where, and how. And we'll just look at some specific points of these. Who, relevant information about identity and characterization. And what is curious is that they do mention diversity in reference to the increasingly diverse content, and they ask the scribes to balance representation and plot to account for this diversity. We have to bear in mind that these commercial platforms, their diversity is constrained by their commercial interest. And of course, they want some diversities to have wider audiences, but they are commercial platforms. So, well, this diversity sometimes is constrained. And they also mention character names or relationships that should be ideally described gradually so as not to reveal things beforehand. As regards what, it's important that visual style or film language is mentioned because initially guidelines or practices were a bit more taxative on that. And even though no specialized knowledge is usually advised, now both these guidelines and also practices admit the importance of film language when they are crucial to the story or genre. And here I have included the example of Orange is the New Black, where the episodes always close with the screen cuts to bright orange, which is relevant for the series. And then the mention about subjectivity, mention that is unavoidable, but description should not be opinionated unless content demands it. So at least there's some nuances in these guidelines. As regards when, where, this is important in a diverse world, again, for the scribers to try and define their audiences, for whom they are describing, what elements are known or unknown. Is it enough to mention Tower Bridge, or do we have to say that it's a turreted bridge over the River Thames? Or can we keep a barretina, or do we have to mention that it's a specific red Catalan hat, which is traditional? As we'll see in some examples, we'll have a glimpse of this audience design in the scribers. And since we are studying multilingualism, it's important to mention how this is dealt with audio description when foreign language is subtitled in the audio description version, is read aloud through audio subtitles, which are read verbatim. In the analogical era, this was not always so. The read aloud subtitles, sometimes there was variation among the written subtitles and the ones that were written. Now they are exactly the same as the subtitles that can be chosen in digital platforms. And a mention of the original audio, which should be kept even though dipped in order to avoid confusion. And important also for audio description that to state subtitles when necessary to avoid confusion. We'll see some example. Then briefly, how we'll look at it in this overview. We'll focus on multilingualism and gender and just a bit of cultural diversity, which are challenges in a globalized world. In connection with multilingualism, it's important to mention the concept of third language, which was coined by Correus in 2008, and then also researched by her and Patrick Zavalbay-Ascoa, which L3 is neither the main language in the source text nor the main language in the target text, but any other language or language variety found in either text. So if I'm analyzing a film translated from English into Spanish, but there are mentions of French throughout, or there's French accent, this would be L3. And this has been researched on specifically with a focus on our description in our research with Montse Correus. Then just a reminder that how this worked in the analogical era, we had analyzed some films, and then the source text for the audio description was the dubbed version. So if that dubbed version already erased or flattened out the presence of a third language or variety, the audio description automatically had also this absence of L3. In the digital age, audio description is done mostly in the source language of the film in video on demand platforms, which is good for L3 present, but can be difficult for sensorial accessibility, as we will comment later. Yeah, and we also had the example I read just before, that sometimes you have to choose either sensorial or linguistic accessibility, right? And let me go back to that Netflix guideline on the original dialogue language. Still allow the viewer to hear the original language, the dialogue in the background. The emphasis here will be on hearing versus understanding the sound of foreign languages in film, which happens a lot in multilingualism. So you look for the quality of sound, and in these cases, it's just you have that in the background to have that glimpse of that L3, that other language, when this is audio subtitle. When there are just mention of specific words in the dialogue or in the description because they are considered cultural references, then you have some other glimpses of that other languages. But in general, users from the perspective in Spain, for example, have to choose either visual accessibility through audio description in English or linguistic accessibility through translated, dubbed or subtitled films. So this is a problem. As regards gender translation and accessibility, I'll only mention that we have researched that in connection with, especially with translation for advertising, and we studied this with our students and with trainers and also with professionals of advertising and translation. And with Montse Correus, we have studied gender and accessibility through interviews with blind women. We have also looked at the depiction of blindness in films, usually with a focus on female characters, and also to see how gender is present, incorporating in audio description. So Marta Mateo has already mentioned these two projects. The first, a film focused on films, and the second on series. So, and in both, we try to have a look at gender, especially in the second one, which has a specific focus on identities, and some members of the group look at it from the culture perspective, some other members from humor, and we look at it from gender perspectives. And we see how L3 is used in gender roles, and also explore the connections between audiovisual translation and gender dynamics. So for the examples, these are the 4 series. We'll just have time for a glimpse, a couple of examples from each, but to have an idea how this is done. Why this series? They are relevant for our projects on translation, multilingualism, and diversity. They are both awarded and popular series, and have been researched from feminist perspectives, translation perspectives, and a little less so from accessibility perspectives. So we'll start with Orange is the New Black. I don't give an introduction to the series because it's well known, and I wouldn't like to lose time. we'll start just viewing a clip where the main character, Piper Chapman, enters the prison and meets the other prisoners in season 1, episode 1. I'll see how identity is constructed through language. So if Joseph could show us the first clip. So I don't know if you could hear well. You saw that Mendoza, the character now you can see on the top left part, when she hears that a new prisoner is called Diaz, she automatically speaks in Spanish, and this is audio subtitled in English, even though it's barely audible. And when this new prisoner, Dayanara Diaz, says, "I don't speak Spanish," Mendoza says, great, another fucking coconut. Coconut has been defined in a World Reference Forum as a person who is tan on the outside, Mexican, Indian, Filipino, and white on the inside. So there's that definition of identity through language, right? And then we'll have just after that, we'll see a clip of another intervention. So in this case, we see that there is no audio subtitling if the text is not necessarily meant to be understood, which is something we research in our project on multilingualism. Is it translated or not? And as you saw from the subtitles, I mean, the conventional, the subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing says speak Spanish. And this is not translated because the main function is attacking, as it were, Diaz for not speaking Spanish in comparison with that Blanca, with that white character who does speak Spanish, right? And by the way, notice that Diaz is described as pursing her lips in annoyment. So even if previously the guidelines, especially in the USA, mentioned that only the facial expression would be described, purses her lips, here the inclusion of annoyment or the emotions are included increasingly. So another clip where also from the first episode where Sophia Burset, who is a trans prisoner and is played by a trans actress, Laverne Cox, is introduced. So we'll have how she is introduced in the series. Here we see how she's just described. I mean, no mention of her trans character is mentioned or needed. She's described as a tall Black woman with long hair, right? And we see that Chapman gawks at her. It is not clear at this stage whether she just gawks because she has touched her hair or just because of sexual diversity. And by the way, it can also be deduced, maybe, we don't know for sure, whether blind users can also make sense of the voice quality of the actress. But it's curious to know that, for example, in the dubbed version in Spanish, they have chosen an actor whose voice may be perceived as androgynous. So sound, again, is important. It can be important for linguistic diversity, and in this case, it's for gender diversity. So, and I just wanted to mention that in this case, the fact that this description of trans characters just based on physical description, it's actually the discourse on trans identity and the conflicts this creates for the prisoner that is incorporated in the discourse itself, differently than in other series. So I will not dwell into Orange is the New Black. I'll just comment it that we, Montecurius and myself, are studying AD, especially focusing on Latina prisoners, where Spanish L3 is a marker of Latina identity. We are following Martinez and González Iglesias' study on Spanish dubbing in Orange is the New Black from intersectional perspectives connecting gender, ethnicity, and class. They have denounced that there is no sexual diversity in Latinas versus the rest of characters, whereas there are more lesbian relations. So it's a kind of a missed opportunity regarding the Latina characters, whereas there's scarcely any mention of lesbianism. And when this is mentioned, it is disregarded by the characters, right? And we have also witnessed that when Spanish language is used, it's related to stereotypical portraits of Latina characters, usually connected to family relations or motherhood and cultural traditions, but not, again, to sexual diversity. And some words are kept in the audio description, some words are kept in the dialogue, and we have witnessed that as the series progresses, there's more incorporation of longer sequences in Spanish, which are then audio subtitles. But at the beginning of the series and at the beginning of episodes, there are just specific mentions of Spanish words just to give some flavor. It's as the series or the episodes progresses that you have more integral content in Spanish. But let's switch to Unorthodox, which there was a mini-series that was offered just 1 year ago, and it was the first series in Netflix to feature Yiddish as a main language alongside English, and this was much publicized. And we have a work in progress with our Mofitabi project. Some colleagues are studying cultural diversity, and Montse Correus and myself are looking at gender diversity in the series and how this is portrayed verbally and non-verbally. So now, since you have just seen some very brief clips, here you'll have a 2-minute audio description to have the feeling of how a series is audio described to give the tone of the series. So here, there are many things. We'll just mention some aspects. We have initial description of character and setting, including adjectives like neatly, immaculate. We have seen that Esti's name is introduced just before the dialogue, because the dialogue takes place in Yiddish, and it's confusing enough as it were. Then from the cultural perspective, there are specific details. Cash in dollars, which you can see on the top of the detail I have included here, is mentioned as just cash, whereas euros are specified. I wonder if this was audio described in Spain, the description would be opposite. And there are also mentions of Jew, concretely Hasidic culture, which I just mentioned. First, the thing about time, but I wonder whether mezuzah, you could see in the picture at the top bottom the right, where Esti lives her apartment, and she touches the mezuzah, that is the small scroll that is on the frames of doors they have to touch before or after entering doors. And the mention of the roof, those are details that are important in audio description depending on the audience you are describing for. And we see that subtitles announce the presence of Yiddish is announced through subtitles, but is barely audible or audible at all. As the miniseries advances, this changes, and there is more Yiddish heard, but initially this is not done. It's difficult to know whether this was for technical reasons or because the beginning is dense enough to make sense of what happens, because the series itself plays with familiarity or unfamiliarity with cultural elements, as is being researched. Then, are we okay for time? Maybe I'll skip that and go directly through a third example in Unorthodox, where Esti, from her escape from her Hasidic community, is now in Berlin and goes to a dance hall for the first time, and then she goes to the restroom, and this is described. Here, we'll see, on the one hand, L3 German is used, and the girls switch to English when they see that Esti doesn't understand them. And this is audio subtitle, even though it's difficult to know which language is being used, the context may leave it clear. And the important thing in this series is the kind of epiphany, which is of course just the label or the name or the trademark of the lipstick, but of course it's significant, a kind of discovery. And this relates to the importance of audio describing written signs, which has been researched, for example, by the ATLAB project, and in a specific chapter, which is very relevant. And in this case, I mean, if it were just another trademark, it wouldn't be important, but of course, given its significance, it's relevant. Also color, not just red, but light red. So it's mentioned, and later we'll see how she goes to buy a lipstick. And again, the play with gazes characters. I mean, they watch and she stares, etc. So the gazes are described, and this implies kind of discovery, as it were. And finally, I've reproduced the example at the end, where the audio description, as it were, follows a bit the rhythm of the music and how Esti gets involved and follows the rhythm, and which parallel and in contrast to Moishe, that character who is following her, right? So let's quickly move to La Casa de Papel, who was translated as Money Heist, and which has been both dubbed and audio described in English. So this is the only case in this series that we have two audio descriptions, in Spanish and in English. I have to mention that I haven't studied and compared them extensively. I know they are being researched in an ongoing projects and have been researched also in master and in MA thesis, but I still have not have access to those. But let's look at maybe the longest clip we'll see today, but I think it's nice to have a look at it now. I've chosen the English audio description instead of the Spanish audio description, but I'll show also some parts of the Spanish audio description. I've underlined in the dialogue the use of beautiful and handsome, etc. Just in connection, I know that the connection is a bit weird. I mean, I mentioned that in the old UK guidelines, there was that discussion on the use of pretty, handsome, etc. in the description. This is not so in the description, but in the dialogue. But it sort of sets the atmosphere and the interaction between the tone of the dialogue and the description, right? And there are not many differences in the audio description. Maybe what might surprise one at first is that usually Spanish audio description used to be more concise than English ones, and here it's not the case, right? But the differences are not very striking in general. Maybe, for example, in the dialogue, but this is the dubbing, not the description. When Denver says, "You are beautiful," in Spanish, he says, "Estás buenísima," which is an adjective that has more sexual connotations, not just physical beauty. But as regards the audio description, maybe there's more emphasis in the Spanish on the description of the lipstick and the hair, but there are not relevant significant differences here. The English audio description is segmented differently. In the Spanish description, both characters, when they go down from the bus, are described simultaneously. Both are described as regards Julia's skirt, and as I said, and in Spanish we have the description of her hair, and also that she is wearing lipstick. And in both description, there's first the surprise of the male characters, and then through the dialogue that does emphasize acceptation, the audio description also emphasizes that acceptation through the embrace. Embrace is abraza, and in Spanish, maybe it's a bit more emphatic. La besa y ríe emocionado. He kisses her and laughs emocionado, moved, right? And however, this fictional representation of sexual diversity does not exclude extra-fictional gender controversies. In this case, for example, not casting a trans actor, which was highly criticized, or overall gender dynamics in the series, which, even though there are some glimpses at some feminist touches, there are still many stereotypes, as the study by Bonavita or de Garay has reflected, with a title, with a study with a telling subtitle, Entre nuevas narrativas y viejos patriarcados, between new narratives and old patriarchy. Right. And finally, we'll move to Merlí, which was a Catalan series that became internationally popular, especially in Latin America, or it was also, for example, fan-subbed in Chinese, for example. It was available in Catalan Spanish previously in Netflix, now on Amazon Prime, but it is also available in public Catalan TV in audio description. That's the only audio description we have available. And in Spanish, we have the version in Catalan subtitled into Spanish, right? In this series, in a similar way to La Casa de Papel, there are some contradictory gender discourses which have been both praised and criticized. And these are particularly visible in a chapter which focuses on Judith Butler and where her theory of performativity and gender construction is explained. I have two clips for that. The first one is in Catalan with the Catalan description. So I'll ask you to bear with me and follow it as you can, and then I'll explain it a bit. And then the second clip, then we'll see it, we'll watch it with in Catalan audio, but with Spanish subtitles, since in that case, there is little audio description, which I'll explain after the clip. So I don't know if you could more or less follow at least the image. And the first description focuses on the feet of a woman, as I have introduced an image on the top right, as she climbs the stair and where she hesitates where to go. And then we have a dialogue in the common room of the teachers, where the headmaster complains that the new masculine teacher called Joaquim is being late for his first class. And this is interrupted by Kima, who says, Kima, my name is Kima. But then when we see the image of Kima, the other description reads, un transvestit, a male transvestite, which is striking because it contradicts the gender discourses that are presented and foregrounded throughout the episode. I have to mention that generally audio description on Catalan TV is good and empathetic. But this example strikes me as exceptionally strange, and the rest is okay. But the problem is that it doesn't work here. So, and we also see how the reaction of the character, which in Catalan say, es queden tots de pedra, menys el Marlí que mig somriu. They are all flabbergasted, as it were, except Merlí, who half smiles. And these contradictory reactions of characters are shown, as I said, in that initial description, but also in the series. And here, as in the case with Moni Hayes, La Casa de Papel, there was criticism of the series because of that vision of trans femininity, and again, for not casting a trans actor. Trans actors find it hard enough to find roles, and then cis actors are used, and this was denounced. And there's another moment in the series which is criticized, as I've shared with you that image and criticism that was on a feminist webpage saying, is trans femininity a kind of cross-dressing game? Because the solution, the final scene in this episode, has a football play done with people cross-dressing. And is it just a matter of cross-dressing? Not, it isn't. So as you see, there are contradictory discourses, but I would like to look at another more positive clip where I think is the gender implications of it are nicer. So let's look at the final clip in this presentation. Bear with me, because in this case, there's no audio description. You'll have the audio in Catalan and subtitles in Spanish, which may help you follow it, but then I'll also comment on it later. So if you could more or less follow it, context. Previously, Merlí, the philosophy teacher, has found it necessary to prepare the class and has introduced the concept of performativity and Judith Butler. You can sort of see it in the blackboard behind the scene. There's only initial AD, and here I'm back translating it from Catalan. So briefly, just Merlí opens the door to the classroom, and then there's dialogue of Merlí introducing Kima, and then we have the description of students in the class. Berta, the girl you see on your left, is white-eyed. In Catalan, ulls com a taronges, with eyes like oranges. Paul and Marc whisper, and it's curious that only in the Spanish subtitles we can actually have access to their whispering. Es un pavo, tío. It's a guy, right? And then Bruno looks at her seriously. If you have followed the series, you know that Bruno is gay and is find it hard to open the closet. So the reactions are different, and then they are solved later, as it were, through laughter and through Kima's reaction. And it's curious that this is done through her English lesson, as it were, which is in the Catalan version has not been audio subtitled, right? Which is different from the other practices we have seen. It's different. It's absolutely impossible to generalize from this. It may be deduced that audience, the audience of Merlí was mainly young, and they are more familiar with English, and the kind of English that is featured here will be understood by young audiences. And there's a kind of subversive, as it were, use of English and slang, and also description. There's no need for audio description, because, as it were, the character of Kima asks students to describe her in terms of gender. So she starts saying, my name is Kima, y punto, and that's it. The problem is that I always have to vindicate my name, and that pisses me off, right? And then at first she translates, and then she offers alternatives in English for her students to learn. There's that mention of being up until her ovaries, but she says that this is not the case. I'm not so much convinced about this, because they actually subverting biology, but the rest of the scene is somehow works. And then works, as we have seen, that they ask their name, and especially to describe your English teacher, which another character, Joan, says, describe the male English teacher. But then Kima asks him to do it, and he says, my English teacher is a woman. So there's that linguistic change that leads to as it were, acceptation of her identity, right? So, and then there are the use of slang, etc., and her message that she wants for students to have words useful for life, and that later this is that she wants to be visible. Okay, so conclusions very briefly. Video on demand platforms do open some possibilities for visual accessibility, especially through audio description, in terms of increasing visibility and presence and some standardization. However, the quality of those practices is unequal in application as regards access or languages. So we still have the challenges of localization versus globalization and certain language asymmetries. There is some attention to diversity, but within some contradictory discourses, which may be related to the fact that many of the series are broadcast in commercial platforms where diversity is seen as something that may attract wider audiences. As regards linguistic diversity, we've seen some increase of multilingualism, but English is more prevalent as main language. We see how in audio description, audio subtitling visibilizes multilingualism in films, but challenges comprehensibility due to that overlap of original and translated soundtracks. And in the case of the perspective from Spain, users have to choose between either language accessibility, for example, dubbed or subtitle versions, or sensory accessibility through audio description and audio subtitling in English. As regards gender and sexual diversity, there is some contested inclusion of gender perspectives in series, and generally there's connection between the audio description practices and the vision of gender or sexual diversity in series, with some exceptions. We have seen some examples where audio description tends to show the character's initial surprise to diversity, followed by acceptation as expressed in the description of characters' gaze and their reactions. And as avenues for research, there are many, among which interdisciplinary research is mapping accessibility and translation practices on large scales, exploring technological possibilities for customization in audio description practices. These are being done, but they're still lowly implemented audio introductions or other technical advances that would allow for more customization for personal linguistic or sensorial access. Large-scale reception studies, which is always a challenge in accessibility. And since we ended with that English lesson, I would just like to mention that the pedagogical implications of training on translation and accessibility in such changing scenarios. Marta mentioned that I have been training on audio description, and it's fascinating to see how practices and guidelines and students' awareness and users' awareness has been changing in a very short time. So we have much work to do and many films to watch and enjoy. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. You've covered so many aspects. You've given us so many different sides of audio description, which itself, it's clear that it opens up so many lines of research. It touches on so many topics, and so it's really a fascinating field to do research in. I don't know if there are, so thank you so much, Eva, and for this comprehensive view, and for the examples were really good, very good, and very illustrative. I don't know whether any participants would like to participate and ask questions. You can either do them now on the spot, verbally, or through the chat if you prefer. Ask your questions in writing, and I can convey them to our guest speaker. But if anybody should like to ask a question right now, please just indicate in some way. Anybody?
I wanted to say that
Jordi? Okay, Jordi Cabella.
yes,
Yep.
yes. I am right now in my first year of the thesis and my PhD, and I'm doing audio description as well, as you said. And I'm taking into account also Netflix, and I'm studying series such as Money Heist and Narcos, and right now a new series called Sky Red and Brigada Costa del Sol, because my thesis, the main topic of my thesis revolves around the audio description of action scenes and how the time constraints come into play. But as well, I'm doing a contrastive approach between English and Spanish. And for example, what you were saying about the priorities, whether you prioritize the audio description, the audio subtitles, or the subtitles just subtitling the transcript, the translation, sorry. And Narcos features both options. It shows audio subtitling, but also subtitling alone. So that should really be interesting to take a look at. And I found your work very enlightening because I'm doing this right now and I've seen so many things I didn't take into account previously. So thank you so much for the presentation and for these results you were talking about and the insight.
Well, thank you very much for your comments. Good luck with your research, which looks challenging. I mean, it's great and action. Wow, it's a lot. I will be looking forward to reading your progress and your results, and then the information about Narcos, which is also being researched in connections with multilingualism by Sofia Iberg in the Pompeu Fabra. I don't know if you know her. She's not looking at audio description. She's looking at multilingualism and again L3, but it would be interesting to share notes. If you like, I could look for her email and you contact her or her supervisor. So, wow, great. And it would be interesting to see whether in action, I mean, if you see trends in extension length, I mean, because action films, in theory, you have more space for description, but you also have lots of soundtrack, which can be very energetic or something, and to what extent there's overlap of the description, or it has to respect the dynamism of action scenes. So, wow, it looks fascinating. Sounds fascinating.
I'd like to ask you, Eva, you mentioned that audio description started in Spain in Netflix in 2015. Yeah, but when did it actually start? When was audio description actually introduced in Spain at all? You know,
at all? In the I think it was in the 90s. I mean, there's I don't know if it was 1989 that I don't remember the name of the film now. In the analogical era, it was either 1899 or 90s, right? I mean, of course, Pilar Orero and some other mentioned that that films broadcast through the radio in the after the Civil War were a kind of audio description of sorts, but the practice in its present current sense, it was in the 90s, right? And then audio description in Spanish started, but in the States with Narcos, I think in August 2015. That's what I found. I mean, and then first. Then Netflix, the platform, was introduced in Spain in October 2015. Exactly when, I mean, if that same year there was that audio description in Spanish in Narcos, I suppose this was also available in Spain, but I don't know if there, what are the titles, the exact years where it was then more and more available. And there's also the problem of products in platforms where they are Netflix originals or they are commissioned and the audio description and the production is prior and then is made available in Netflix, is very difficult then to find and look for dates, right? I don't know if I'm answering at all what you were asking, Marta.
Could you explain to those participants who are less familiar maybe with audio description, whether audio description actually started as a translation tool, or whether it started as an accessibility tool in the source language and then it was taken advantage of by translation, by audiovisual translation, and to make use of it also in translated products?
And the brief answer would be accessibility, right? But the long answer is that, for example, I mean, audio description advocates like Joel Snyder, for example, I mean, came to Spain and trained. I mean, the training was international and this influence. And if you look at, for example, at some early audio descriptions, for example, as you mentioned, I studied also documentaries and documentary translation and also documentary audio description. And some audio described documentaries of National Geographic available in Spanish, they sound like translations, right? I do not claim that they are translations, but the style looks very much like translation. And there has been always that debate, I mean, that discussion, if there is little audio description, why not pull sources and translate audio description? And it is a discussion that comes and goes. I mean, it would be somehow convenient, right? But you also have to take into account that cultural diversity that I was commenting in connection with, for example, Unorthodox, right? I mean, cultural references should go back, I mean, and revise. But this was research, for example, by Catalina Jimenez and Julian Bourne, and is being researched also by Anna Jankowska. And what is true is that translation studies has incorporated accessibility studies in their research field. But there are some audio describers, for example, in Spain, who do not consider it necessary to know foreign languages because they consider it as an accessibility service. And in theory, this would be okay, but in a multilingual world, or sometimes even look at how the names, I mean, how names sound in some audio descriptions, the pronunciation of foreign names sometimes is is a bit distracting. I know that there are many issues. One is practice and this research, and translation and accessibility in theory should go hand in hand, right? But it is actually an open discussion.
Thank you. Any questions? I've got a few
Yes.
questions, but yeah,
Thank you. Thank you, Marta. And Eva, thank you so much for being so generous with me. A very interesting talk. One question, you said that the Spanish audio description is not very different from the English one in La Casa de Papel, except for slight differences, such as being more concise in the Spanish audio description. Could you have the opportunity to analyze if this also applies to other series? I mean, could we say that in general, there's not much difference between Spanish and English audio description, and that audio description is more concise than in English, than the English one?
In this case, I mean, in the analogical era, except for those documentaries, which were very detailed in Spanish, in contrast with English, where you have, I mean, more space for detailed description. In general, in the analogical era, from what I have seen, audio description were generally more concise. Whereas in this episode, in La Casa de Papel, actually the Spanish audio description is a bit longer. not shorter. But as I say, I haven't studied it in depth, right? But what in this case, I wanted to see whether, I mean, we had evidences of that one was the translation of the other, and this is not evident. And another thing that I didn't mention is that credits. I was looking for the credits of these audio descriptions, and even though the guidelines mention that audio description should be credited, I only found in the series that I have analyzed credits for the most recent one, that is Unorthodox, and I think it was la Money Heist, La Casa de Papel, but the English one, not the Spanish one, right? So I haven't actually looked at it in depth. And as I say, there are researchers on this which probably will have discovered it, right? But it's interesting to see.
Thank you.
I don't know if you know this series, which we can see here in the United States, called In the Dark. Do you know this series about a blind young woman who's, gets involved in a crime incident, and in the dark, and the protagonist is a blind woman? Have you heard of it?
No, but I'm taking note of it because, I mean, we have with Monse again, we examined some films and series where blindness itself, or where blind characters are described.
Yeah, it's in Netflix. And it's interesting also because of something you mentioned in your talk, because one of the main characters is a lesbian, and one of her partners is actually, I think, a Latin girl, because you mentioned that lesbianism was hardly ever present in Latino characters. In this case, I think you would have an example there, I think.
Well, this series has it all. I mean,
yeah. I don't know if the title is in Spanish. I think in English it's In the Dark.
I'll definitely have a look at it. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Any other questions from any other participant?
Yes, this is Martha Villa from New York City. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't have my camera on because I'm in my computer and my camera is not working, but I wanted to thank the presenter. It's a really fascinating presentation. I'm totally blind and I've been just using audio description for a few years. Well, not a few years, what should I say? 1 year. I find it really, it's very good. And I truly hope that this field would continue growing for those of us who have some visual impairment. But I would like to ask you, you think this field will be, is it going to continue? Well, in your view, if this will be something that people would be interested in, more and more students or professionals to make it a career? Is it a growing field for, I mean, do you think that this will continue or become something as, translation or interpretation? Would this, is there a lot of room for describers or audio describers, or are people interested in this that you see in Spain and in other countries?
Thank you very much, Martha. I think, well, this is growing. I mean, on the one hand, on research, I mean, there are many research projects on that. In the profession, it is growing. And also, I mean, it's also growing because of legal
right.
Right. I mean, for example, in the States, at least there has been pressure, I mean, from association, etc. And you have to do it, and you have to do it 30 days after the premiere. In Spain or in Europe, this is a bit slower as regards legislation. But for example, the Accessibility Act, which was passed, it wasn't very specific on digital platforms, but the spirit is there. So from the studies I read from Garcia Prieto, for example, I mean, there is will in the European landscape of actually making it more and more to enforce the application of such regulations. in Spain, so far, it's still the will of the platforms. But when there's more obligation, there is more opportunities. However, some senior audio describers also complain that, for example, that when audio description, for example, in Spain was mainly taken care through La ONCE, the Spanish Organization of the Blind, and the quality was really well taken care of. When there was that kind of liberalization, because audio description became compulsory to have 10 hours of audio description on TV, that's not a lot, but this raised the pressure for more quantity of description. And because of money matters, then they went for cheaper services, and the quality was not always good. So again, the brief answer would be yes, there is future. The more complex answer would be yes, there is. We'll see how they manage and how the legislation or force from users changes it. But there's also, for example, when I talk to people without visual disabilities about audio descriptions, and they say, but do you think this is really important? I have realized that, for example, all the people at home who in the past, they're just flipping on with their TV channel, they opted for the audio description so as to combine it with their daily chores, or for elderly people with cognitive problems, because
right, like
they're
audiobooks.
more aware. So there's really, it's accessibility for all, really. Or people, for example, the rise of audiobooks, or there's that pressure for Netflix audio only. So imagine Netflix audio only, including audio description. That would be just great, right? So yes, there is future.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions? It's so fascinating about this, what you've just said, and the example you mentioned of this receiver who switched onto the English audio because it had audio description when she needed it, and then switched back into the Spanish. That reminded me of what Eva Gambier called the fragmented ways of reading, that the new audiovisual products and multimedia products are producing, are provoking, changing our way of reading. And I think this would be an example too. And also what you've just said of people using audio description because they are combining watching something with their chores, domestic chores. So my final question is, have you started doing any reception studies yourselves? Because also when you gave us this, you showed this example about with the trans actor, and it wasn't mentioned. It wasn't mentioned in the audio. I wonder what the effect would be in a blind receiver and a non-blind receiver. What the different effects would be of seeing or not seeing and not being told, whether that would be noticeable straight away because of the voice, or whether it wouldn't be, and what the effects of the scene would be, if there are any differences. I don't know whether you've done any research along these lines.
Not so far, not personally. I have supervised research which used reception studies, but not first on this particular topic, but in an informal conversation with other colleagues, like, for example, Blanca Arias Badia. We commented on these topics and thought, and she suggested this has to be researched, to see, users' perceptions, distinctions, etc. But of course, this requires time and resources. What I have is supervised research. For example, a recent doctor at the University of Vic, Florian Bardini, she researched the use of film language and the enjoyment and emotions in users. And she, to have groups of, I think it was 45 users. It is difficult because you have to have the resources, you have to respect users' times. And because, I mean, there's many people who want to do research, we have to beware not to saturate end users. So in reception studies are very important, and sometimes it's challenging because, I mean, and people are generous and they are great, but you cannot you feel them used. I mean, you have to see when and how you can do it. And so far, I mean, food for thought for future research. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much, Eva. This has been fascinating. Thank you for sharing with us this fascinating topic, your research, which is so solid and always so interesting, and for explaining it to us. And thank you, everybody, for your presence here. It's been great to have Eva here today, and so many colleagues from Barcelona as well, and from other universities in the States. We have some regulars and some new people. So, and I invite you all to send us your email if you want to receive our announcements of future events. You're very welcome to write to us, and we'll include you in our database. So thank you, Eva. Thank you so much. I hope to see you here in person sometime in the future. And this has worked perfectly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.